is how many exist. I think that really is understated, that there are thousands of species of amphibians across the world. Now, when we think about this, most of them are actually frogs. So of the known amphibian species, and again, this changes probably every year or so, we start identifying new species of amphibians still. So this is always in flux. But what we do know is that the overwhelming majority are frogs. Then what we have are a collection of salamanders and newts are effectively just a type of salamander. We have several hundreds of those. Then we have these weird, funky organisms called caecilians, which make up just a few percent of amphibians in the world. They are like these kind of like worm-like amphibians that live mostly in the tropics of South America. What's also interesting is that when you look at amphibians, the lineages, the brothers and sisters of the species that we see today have been around for 300 plus million years. That means that if you look at that time frame geologically, whatever happened within that time frame, amphibians somehow have found a way to survive. So even though today, and we'll talk about this, we think about them as being pretty sensitive organisms, really good environmental indicators, and we think that they might be harmed pretty easily. But the reality is they're pretty resilient organisms. So what we'll talk about today and the reasons that they're under harm is even more alarming, because whatever the dinosaurs became extinct from, amphibians lived through. So I wanted to direct you to this really cool website called amphibiaweb.org. And this is a website that will catalog many of the amphibian species on Earth, especially in North America. And it'll give you a bunch of really cool facts and information about them. And what this website produced was this map of the species of amphibians around the world. So in this map, you can see the darker areas represent areas where there's more amphibian species, so there's more individuals and taxa. And you can see parts of the world are really great for this, for amphibians. South America is really high in diversity, parts of Madagascar and Africa. And then you have Asia as a really big hotspot for a lot of amphibians to persist. Just really great habitat there. I also wanted to point out what I think is the coolest amphibian. This is the patch-nosed salamander. This is a species that I had the pleasure to help describe as a graduate student in Georgia. We found it on the side of the road in a stream in Georgia. My friend Bill found it, the first one. And a team with myself worked to describe it as a whole new genus of salamander. And what's really unique about it is this is an adult female here, and she has eggs in her belly, but she can fit and curl up on a dime. So they're one of the smallest salamanders in the world. What's also cool about this group of salamanders is that they're lungless. So they have vertebrates, but they have no lungs as well. So they breathe entirely through their skin. This is a pretty cool species as well because they have a really different life history. They lay eggs in water, and their babies act like fish with gills, and then they metamorph out and they turn into these adults that live on land. So they have these really cool aspects to their life. But I wanted to also talk more about why amphibians are so cool. So what I view this as is these traits that make amphibians really interesting to study, but also really important to ecosystems. So we know, and I just talked about how diverse amphibians are. Thousands of species around the world. There are some areas that are hotspots of amphibian diversity. Some areas in the US are hotspots for salamander diversity, where there's more species than anywhere else in the world. We also know that these organisms are really abundant. So where you find amphibians, there's usually a lot of them there. One of the cool studies I did was looking at this little black salamander that lives in forests across the US. There's several species of this one salamander. They call it the slimy salamander. The reason they do that is because when you pick one of these up, it excretes this mucus, and that mucus is super sticky, like stick your hands together sticky. And this little black and white salamander lives all across forests, really about in the eastern US and a little bit into Arkansas and Missouri. And what the study that we did found was that if you looked at how many of these salamanders exist in the forest and you weighed them all, they would weigh more than all of the small birds in the area. They would weigh more than all of the small mammals in the area. And if you added up and weighed all the deer in the forest, these salamanders would outweigh those as well. They're about as big as your finger, but there's so many of them around that their biomass, how much they weigh collectively, is more than all of these different species that you commonly think of as being really abundant. So this is just one example of how amphibians are really important in terms of the biomass of Earth. We'll talk about a lot more about this. Remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and bring them up, and I'll be able to answer them as we go forward too. What also makes amphibians really cool is that they have different, what we call life histories. So we know that there are groups of amphibians that live just on land entirely their whole life. They never go near water. A lot of these lungless salamander species that I study never go on land. They live on land, or never go in water. They live on land, they lay their eggs on land, and that's it. But most commonly, what you think of as an amphibian is something that has what's called a biphasic life cycle. Amphibians that might live on land for part of their life, but then live in the water for part of their life. Usually, the babies live in the water, and then they hatch out and metamorph and live on land. So that two-way life cycle where they're living in land and water is called biphasic. What we also know is that amphibians are what are called poikilothermic. Now, you probably heard this term is called cold-blooded, but amphibians' blood isn't necessarily cold. Cold-blooded just means that it's an ectotherm. Ectotherm means that the amphibian, in its physiology and its blood and body, is really maintained by the temperature outside. And another way to say that is poikilothermy. So these amphibians being poikilothermic is really important. Here's some neat diagrams here. So this one here is looking at a frog life cycle, a typical frog life cycle, that they lay eggs in water usually. These eggs hatch and turn into tadpoles and froglets. We see a lot of salamander species doing the same thing. So this group of salamanders here in Illinois, they breed in ponds. So the adults live on land for most of the year. A couple days out of the year, they'll surface and they'll all run to ponds and lay their eggs. And those larvae can hatch out and then turn into again. Sometimes they hang back in the water frogs as well in the tropics that lay their eggs on land entirely. This species here is a Slimy Salamander species. I study them for one of my graduate degrees, and this is the mom taking care of her eggs right here. We also know that amphibians have what we call permeable skin. Just means that they have a lot of holes in their skin, and normally that's used for gas exchange or to breathe, and for moisture exchange as well. But what we see is that this is kind of a detriment to amphibians these days. There's so many different toxins in the water that humans have produced that we'll talk about what that actually can do to amphibians. But I think it makes them cool because they can breathe through their skin, and like this wood frog here, they can breathe with using lungs as well. Okay, I'm still waiting for questions, so go ahead and bring them up as you see fit. Okay, so this is another issue that we have with amphibians, and it really boils down to they are declining. Currently, what we're undergoing in the world in terms of all biodiversity in the world is what's called a mass extinction event. And what we've seen historically is that throughout the years, we can see using the fossil record that there have been events where most of the species on Earth have gone extinct. And so far, there have been 5 of these that we know of. They happened in this late Ordovician period, the Devonian, the Permian, Triassic, and then we see this one in the late Cretaceous. This happened about 65 million years ago. This is where the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, historically, for most of these, it was some sort of mixture of climate change, natural climate change occurring. There were changes in the atmosphere, and it just made conditions bad for species on Earth. The dinosaur extinction, called the KT extinction, occurred when an asteroid hit the Earth. It basically blocked out the sun and caused a bunch of changes to the atmosphere as well. What we're seeing today is that, especially with amphibians and some other taxa, they are undergoing a 6th mass extinction event, and is driven 100% by human causes.
Dr. Milanovich, there was a question on YouTube that
Okay.
applies. I think it's a clarification statement, maybe. You had said that the question is, you had said that there are, some regions of the world have amphibians versus more salamanders, and kind of vice versa. They're wondering if that is connected to the amounts of surface waters available, or not related to something like that.
Good question. So what we see is that where you see areas where there's a lot of amphibian diversity for all species, let's say, it usually means that there's favorable climate. So it's usually relatively warm all year, relatively moist all year. So the parts of Asia and South America and Madagascar that have really high amphibian diversity usually means just that. It's warm, it's wet, pretty consistently. Now, when you look at the US, it's a little different. We do see most amphibian diversity in the US and the Southeast, where it's warmer and wetter most of the year. The salamanders that I highlighted there are this lungless form, and their highest diversity is in the Smoky Mountains in the US, which is a little bit cooler but moist. And really, it's the same characteristic where that mountain range creates really ideal conditions for this group of salamanders to persist. So historically, they were able to create a bunch of species and still survive because the conditions are so good. But you're right, generally across the world with all amphibians, if it's wet and moist consistently, there'll be a ton of amphibians there.
Thank you.
So what we're going to talk about really for the most of the rest of the talk are why are amphibians declining and how much they are, and what sort of causes are relating to their declines that we're seeing and so worried about. What we know is that we estimate about one out of 3 amphibian species are at risk of extinction on Earth. And we say estimate because, like I mentioned, we're still describing species of amphibians. And in addition to that, there's a lot of species that we know exist, but we don't know a whole lot about them. We don't know much about their life history, or how many there are, or if they exist still. So this number could be even greater than 1 out of 3 amphibians. And that's a little bit what we're worried about. What we also know is that if you look at the rate at which organisms generally go extinct naturally, it's usually about 1 to 5 species a year. That's just natural extinction that occurs. And what we're seeing is that the amphibian extinction rate is much higher than that, 25 to 45,000 times higher than what we would consider the background extinction rate of an amphibian. So what we're seeing is that they are becoming extinct at a much faster rate than what we would expect they should be going extinct naturally. And again, what we know, this is a rough number, so to speak. So give or take, 10 or so species, but we think that there's around 170 or so species that have gone extinct just in the past 20 years. And again, this is a rough number because, there are species in the tropics that we still don't know if they are extinct, there are species in the tropics that we don't know exist still. So we do know that there's at least this number for the most part that have gone extinct, and there's likely many more that we're waiting to confirm their full-on extinction. So again, remember, amphibians are going through this mass extinction event, and generally, these are the 5 primary causes that most scientists would suggest is leading to these amphibian declines. And what's interesting is that amphibians are getting really hardly hit by these different causes of their decline, but all of these causes are applicable to basically every other species on Earth, really including humans. So what we're generally seeing is that amphibians are on the forefront of this decline with fish and some other taxa, but all the other taxa on Earth, mammals and birds, are still being threatened by these causes as well, just not to the extent that amphibians are. So we're going to talk about each of these separately, but again, chime in with any questions that you have throughout the seminar. So the first thing I want to talk about is habitat destruction. Most scientists would argue that this is the #1 cause of species decline on Earth, and you can confidently say it's the #1 cause of amphibian declines, is that we're simply taking away their habitat. And what we generally see is that there's a pretty direct link where amphibian species require specific habitats. Maybe that's a forest or a pond or a wetland. It could be some sort of prairie ecosystem. And as those are shrinking in size, as we start converting those to agriculture or cities, or we start destructing them for other reasons, then we see just the sheer amount of habitat that amphibians and other organisms have is declining. What we also see is that the habitat that's left is what we call fragmented. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that if this amphibian species that live in this area required forest, they still have some forest here, a little bit here, some back here. But in between that forest, there is areas that are not forested, that are agriculture. And what this does for many amphibian species in particular is basically restricts their movement across the landscape. So the ones that live here are stuck, so to speak, within this forested ecosystem, because once they leave it, the habitat's not suitable for them to go across the landscape and find another forest. Remember, they have permeable skin, so they need these kind of wet, moist conditions for the most part to cross long distances. And also, you got to remember, they're really small, so it's hard for amphibians to move across areas. And what we see is that this fragmentation not only limits how much area there is for these species, but it breaks apart those connections. And that, in combination, is really one of the leading causes of why we see amphibians declining.
Here's a question that I think relates to that, and I don't know where the exact source is because I'm getting text messages, so I apologize for that. But this person is trying to wrap their head around that part where you said that it stunned them when you said, that they've been around since dinosaurs, but dinosaurs are gone and they stayed.
Yeah.
They're just trying, and maybe there's not an answer to this, but it is a very interesting question. Like, how did they survive when dinosaurs didn't? So I don't know if you have an answer for that, but it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't there when this occurred, but based on what we know, the species that, let's say, for lack of a better term, that came out of this extinction event, we know that alligators were around, crocodiles. We know that there are turtle species, there are amphibian species, there's some mammal species that kind of originated from what was left over. And generally what we believe is that there were organisms, the ones that were best suited for this were had a couple traits. Let's say a lot of them lived underground, so they weren't necessarily connected to these atmospheric changes that may have caused a lot of harm. In addition to that, a lot of them were, let's say, pretty flexible with, what they ate. So maybe they're generalists in some capacity. So amphibian species in this capacity maybe ate, decaying vegetation, which there's a lot of. They can eat a number of different bug species, which still persisted on Earth. And then the third trait probably was, especially for amphibians, that they really don't need a lot to survive in terms of resources. So a lot of the salamanders I study can go underground for months and not eat and still survive. And then they get a big meal or a meal, and that can maintain them for months and months and months, sometimes over a year. We see some frog species with the same mechanism where they can kind of burrow down in the desert and live there for a year or two if they want to. So a lot of the species that came out of this extinction event had these kind of built-in mechanisms where they can kind of shut down or live underground or live off less resources. So amphibians weren't the only group of taxa that survived this extinction event. And I think when you look at it, dinosaurs were really poorly suited for something that happened. When you look at these huge organisms that need to eat their weight in plants basically every day, that's not conducive to something that happened when, effectively the sun is being blocked out of the sky with ash. So the organisms that survived were generally smaller, can kind of shut down their physiology, and have some flexibility in what they eat. So I think hopefully that answers your question. That's at least what we think.
It does, and the follow-up to that, there's now a follow-up question. So this is apparently a very hot topic. The follow-up to that is, and again, it's a statement like, it's interesting then that they could survive that, whatever happened to the dinosaurs, and yet we are in this mass extinction. You're talking about fragmentation. So, drawing that connection between habitat, they don't have that habitat, I guess that's their question, is like, what,
Yeah,
how is the human impact versus whatever happened to the dinosaurs? Interesting.
yeah, it's a good question. So I think it's not. You still have to realize that most amphibians probably did go extinct when the asteroid hit. Some of them survived, right? That's the most turtles, most crocodiles, most of those kind of mammal-like organisms. Most of them probably went extinct along with the dinosaurs, but just a few survived. So, what we see today is not unsimilar. When you look at the mass extinction event with the dinosaurs, it was an asteroid hit the Earth. Very quickly after that, within a couple weeks, the entire Earth atmosphere and the conditions changed. When you look at that in terms of like a geologic time, it's not really unsimilar to what we've done as humans. Over the last really 100 years is when we have implemented these changes that have caused amphibians and other taxa to decline. So when you think about how long these species have been on Earth, yes, they've been evolving and they've been adapting and collecting all these different tools to survive all these different environmental conditions. As they were doing that, the environmental conditions were changing pretty slowly. There are changes in and out of ice ages, for example. Those would take thousands of years to occur. So the species that persisted were able to kind of incrementally go along with the changes. What we're seeing today, what's happening now, is really over the past 100 years or even a little bit less, we've made these huge changes to Earth. And they're so fast that the species simply can't keep up with the changes. So, the extinction events going on today are, at a similar pace geologically to the other mass extinction events. And it's because we're implementing changes at a similar pace to other mass extinction events. So, all of the mass extinction events showed amphibians declining, at least the ones that have happened since they've been on Earth. And this is not unlike that. So we expect that there very well could be species that survive what humans are doing over the next 100 or 200 years, but most of them probably won't.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's keep going and talking more about these threats to amphibians. So we also know that there are a number of diseases that impact amphibians. I just want to highlight 3 of them that are pretty scary. The first one is called the BD fungus. You may know it as called the Chytrid fungus. And this was really alarming in the 1980s, still alarming today, but at first, what we started noticing as scientists, and this is led by a crew with Dr. Karen Lips, and what they're noticing is that in this western part of Central America, all of a sudden, they were seeing these really fast, large-scale declines of amphibians. I mean, like frogs floating in streams still, just dead by the hundreds and thousands. And then if they looked a little bit farther east, the amphibians were fine. But every single year, they started seeing farther and farther to the east these die-offs of these amphibians. And very quickly, a team of scientists identified this as this fungal infection called the Chytrid fungus. They now call it the BD fungus. And they were able to track this fungus as it moved across to the Panama Canal every year, inching forward as the conditions were right. And Chytrid is something that we're still learning a lot about. What we see is that it has a really big impact in the tropics, especially. Now, you can find the Chytrid fungus where I am in Chicago. You can find it all across the US, but we don't see it killing a lot of amphibians. So there's several hypotheses of why this might be occurring. And there's a mixture of, we think it's something to do with the environment. Most likely the temperature, maybe rainfall, has to be within certain conditions, and it triggers the fungus to become harmful, effectively toxic. What it basically does is clog up the pores and alter the shape of the mouths of young amphibians, and they simply kind of choke to death, unfortunately. And that's one of the ways that Chytrid has an impact. The second one I want to discuss is called the Rhona Virus. This is a viral infection in amphibians that they get that has caused major declines in amphibians. And again, we see this in many parts of the world. We see it in the United States as well, but it's really an odd virus where you can have a pond that has Rhona virus and frogs are living freely and happy. And then you can go a half a mile away and have a frog pond that has Rhona virus where they all die. Again, we're still trying to figure out what is going on with this virus, but it's causing a lot of concern. The third one is called B-Sal. This is another fungal infection that exclusively impacts salamanders. Right now, what we see is that it is mostly restricted to Europe. And we're trying our best to not allow it to spread across the world. But you have to remember, one of the reasons that these diseases, a lot of ways, are harmful to amphibians is that they are pretty novel. So, for instance, you can have salamanders that have been exposed to B-Sal in Europe that might be able to combat it. But as we incorporate the pet trade, as people travel across the world, they can carry these fungi and viruses with them and introduce them to new species or populations in a different part of the world that have never seen them. So there's a number of kind of reasons that these diseases are worrisome, and we're really still in the infant stages of learning about them, and people are working as hard as they can to figure out how to combat them and how we can maybe treat amphibians in the wild or reduce the impacts of these. But it's still ongoing, and they're a huge region of decline of these species as well. The third thing I wanted to bring up with respect to amphibian declines is something you probably heard of pollutants. And I'm lumping pollutants in with nutrient additions, pesticides, pharmaceuticals. What basically happens is that as humans are living on Earth, we are doing a number of things that create environments that aren't suitable for amphibians. For example, we most likely think of factories, right? The factories are oftentimes producing toxic waste. Sometimes that waste gets released into the environment on purpose, gets into the waterways. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes they don't even know what's happening. But you have these pollutants entering the environment from these kind of factory mechanisms. Then we also have humans. We're taking pharmaceuticals and we are ingesting them, going to the bathroom, and they're going into our wastewater plants. And that's really hard to get out of wastewater, these kind of accumulations of these pharmaceuticals that we take. So they then get into the watershed, and these two kind of competing traits, effectively, mechanisms, lead to water accumulating these toxins, either pharmaceuticals or other toxins. You also have agricultural runoff with fertilizers and pesticides. All of this gets in our waterways. And effectively, the water cycle is all connected. So the water that is in a stream eventually gets connected to either the groundwater or surface wetland or pond or lake. And then these amphibians are exposed to these toxins. So there's been a number of studies about what has occurred and what has happened. But what we see is that there are a couple things that can occur. There could be just mortality. So these toxins or pharmaceuticals or fertilizers, pesticides, all this can directly kill frogs and salamanders and other amphibians, either as adults or as babies, or even as eggs. They can also create these challenges of morphology. So you have this frog here is developed without a leg. This one has an extra leg. So we see all these different morphological changes. Dr. Tyrone Hayes at the University of California, Berkeley is one of the leading scientists that showed these pollutants in the environment are having big impacts on frogs and salamander species. And also, what we can also see is that sometimes there can be changes to the sex of frogs and salamanders as a function of pharmaceuticals. So as they accumulate in the waterways, like everything else in the water, it gets through these amphibian skin and it can reverse the sex. It can change. Oftentimes what it does is either change male frogs or salamanders to female, or female to male is a little bit more rare. But it changes their sex or makes them hermaphroditic. It could do a number of different things. So it can impact directly populations by killing them. It can alter their morphology and their ability to survive by these deformities. And it can change populations by altering the sex ratios too. So it's pretty alarming, but it's a good indicator, that we see this occurring to species that are sensitive to this particular input in the waterways. And it's not too many links from humans. If this is occurring to amphibians because of what's accumulating in the water, it could happen to humans. It's just a step up. So it's something that we're pretty alarmed about. There's a question here. Has there been a noticeable change in population growth, either a decrease or increase during the pandemic? I think the answer is that we don't know yet, unfortunately. And that's primarily because, like the rest of the world, scientists have been largely sidelined in the pandemic. So our research has, slowed down quite a bit for most of us, or has even come to a halt for some of us. So I don't think we can answer if the pandemic has had any effect on the population of amphibians at all. My guess would be probably not, unless you're looking at like the direct take of amphibians from the wild, which we'll talk about. But most of these things that are occurring are still occurring, right? We're still polluting the environment. The habitat destruction has occurred or is at least still occurring to some degree. So I would say it's still ongoing to determine if there's an impact or not. Okay, the fourth thing I want to talk about is really something that is a little bit more predictive than real time impact, and that's global climate change. And what I want to do first is just give you a bit of perspective of why this is so bad for amphibians, or why we predict it will be. So when we look at global climate change as a whole, we call it that for a reason. It's because the climate is changing on Earth, and even though Earth, on average, the global temperatures are absolutely increasing, we don't expect that all areas on Earth will be warming. Some might be cooling down, some might be warming more than others, just based on these kind of climatic factors. So with amphibians in particular, what we're really worried about are a couple things. As the climate changes, and that means, yes, we're going to warm collectively, but across the Earth, there's going to be either drought or extra rain or colder weather or warmer weather. So all these different changes are going to occur. So the amphibians that live across the world are going to be exposed to different changes. They might have increased drought. They might have too much water, especially if they're terrestrial salamanders. Or they might be impacted directly by the warming of this. Now, the warming amphibians right now we have seen has altered their what's called their phenology. So when they do things in life, when they start breeding, when they start mating, that is already changing for some amphibian species as temperatures warm earlier in the winter, as they warm earlier in the spring, extend that growing season. We're starting to see amphibians changing a bit, when they start doing things. So that's one concern that we have, is that they're responding to climate change already. What we're also concerned about in the future is that amphibians generally live in environments that are pretty stable. So they've evolved and they've adapted to live, across all the way up to the Arctic Circle, across into the tropics, but they've evolved with these conditions being pretty similar for thousands of years. So when we start changing the climate in the Arctic, or in the Midwest United States, when things get warmer, drier, or wetter, we're just not sure amphibians will be able to evolve with those changes because they're happening so quickly. One of the things that we're worried about is that amphibians can't move very far, very fast. So if you're a bird, you can fly to an area that's warmer, colder, and migrate. But amphibians are much smaller, and they're also much less mobile. So whatever conditions they're exposed to is generally what they're going to be exposed to for a long time, through generations, not just their own life. So one of the cool studies that my lab has done, this is my former grad student, Brock Struger. Brock looked at the amphibians in the Midwest, and he basically was able to model what amphibians were where based on the current climate. And then he took the predicted change in the climate based on climate change, and he asked, what's going to happen to amphibians in the future? What are some predictions that we have? What Brock showed was that if you look at the amphibian species, these are areas where the red areas have more amphibian species in the Midwest. We're about right here in Chicago. The blue areas have less species right now. What Brock showed is that whether or not the climate changes really drastically or less drastically will really impact how many species will be around in the Midwest. And there's a number of these studies that have predictions that the amphibian species are going to decline pretty drastically. Like you see here, the deep red areas are gone. There's more dark blue areas, which mean less species. So what Brock's study predicted in the Midwest is that with the climate changing in the next 50 or 100 years, or even 10 years, we expect that we might start seeing amphibian declines associated with it. So climate change is something that we're concerned about pretty heavily, and we're really keeping an eye on it, and hoping that humans collectively start doing some climate mitigation, which we can do a lot of, quite a bit. One question here is whether or not I have resources such as books or documentaries that we can recommend. Yeah, a ton of them. So the first thing I would recommend is something called this series that the BBC made called Life in Cold Blood. And this is a documentary series on amphibians and reptiles that Sir David Attenborough produced and stars in. And if you look at the salamander part of it, you can see that part of my research on these lungless salamanders is presented in this work. But that's really cool. Some of the best imagery you can ever find on amphibians and reptiles is found in that Life in Cold Blood series. Also, with respect to books, there are a number of what are called field guides that are really good. I would recommend the Peterson Field Guide. They're for North America and different parts of North America. Also, there's a book called Amphibian Declines of North America, which is really good. There's a bunch of books about salamanders. There's just really a number of books that have came out recently that are really captivating. What I would also recommend is looking up science papers. So if you go to the website scholar.google.com, you can use that as a Google search for scientific articles. And you can type in amphibian declines or terrestrial salamanders or whatever you want, and you'll find actual papers that scientists wrote that you can learn more about the studies that we conduct on these species, anything that you want. So I would recommend those kind of three ways to kind of look at things: the documentaries from the BBC, the field guide books, and then these scientific literature. I think that's great to get into as well. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about is something called the pet trade, or what I like to call overexploitation. Now, this encompasses a bunch of different metrics, but effectively, there's kind of two main themes that are occurring across the world. There's a lot of times where we are going into the wild, or humans are going into the wild, and they're collecting animals and then basically moving them across the world for people to keep as pets. And I'm not saying this is something wrong to do, but what is wrong is going into the wild, taking these animals from the wild and doing it. What I would much prefer is that we breed animals that are already in captivity to then trade or sell in the pet trade. So it's much more regulated. Right now, this pet trade isn't regulated very much at all. So you have people going into the wild and taking animals that are wild caught versus animals that are already in captivity for generations that you can breed. So that's one big issue, is that we are taking species from the wild and trading them or selling them for our use. The second thing is that amphibians are a major food source for humans still in some parts of the world, in particular in Asia. And it's such a big food source that we are collecting them from the wild in great enough numbers that we're seeing a lot of amphibians declining as a result of that. So these two mechanisms of taking animals from the wild is really having a pretty big impact, not just from removing the animals so their populations go down, but it also acts as an avenue to transmit diseases as well. So another quick question here, whether or not there are organizations that rescue exploited amphibians sold as pets, and there definitely are. And I forgot the names of them directly. I think one of them is called Amphibian Arc, and that might be more of an organization that does just this. They captive breed amphibians and they don't do it necessarily to have them being sold as pets, but they do it so they can conserve those amphibians if they go extinct in the wild. There's also a number of organizations that will not necessarily rescue these exploited amphibians, but that are trying to increase legislation that would regulate the pet trade and stuff. So that's really, I think, where we should go with this, is trying to address the problems with the regulation of the pet trade, and then address the problems of food shortage and some education, so we can try to limit the collection of these animals for food. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about what does this all mean? So I just told you that these amphibians are in decline. I told you how cool they were, but now what does it mean that they're in decline? What sort of consequences could there be if these organisms are declining at a faster rate? What we know very little about, unfortunately, is how much amphibians are important to feeding other animals. We know they're an important food source. We just don't know much about what would happen if these organisms are gone. So we know they're great prey. They're full of nutrients and protein. Usually where there are amphibians, like I mentioned, there's a lot of them. They're usually pretty fat and slow like me, so they're easy food resource. So we see that they're great for consumption, and a lot of animals eat them. It's just a very few studies about showing how important they actually are. So that's something that we're looking into more and more. We also know that amphibians are important for what we call ecosystem functions. So every ecosystem is connected in all these different ways. And what we know is that since amphibians are so abundant, there's so many of them, that they not only are important for organisms to eat and for what they eat themselves, but that they can actually be important for processes that the ecosystems need. So if you remember, those little tiny salamanders I studied, they are so abundant in the forest that they outweigh mammals and deer and birds. So when you have so many of these, hundreds of thousands of these little salamanders out, they're all eating and they're all going to the bathroom. And that can actually have big impact on the nutrient cycling of forest. For instance, if you have this little salamander here and it's eating bugs at its leisure, those bugs have a certain amount of phosphorus in it. That frog is going to, or that salamander is going to take up that phosphorus. It's going to use some of the phosphorus for its bones. It's going to use some of it to, create phospholipids, all these different things it needs it. And some of it's going to be excess, and it's going to poop it out. So what this salamander is doing is taking this resource in this form of a bug, it's using it, and then it's going to excrete that excess phosphorus in a form that is inorganic. And then algae and plants and other things can uptake it. So it's taking this bug nutrient and recycling it back into the forest through pooping. So this can be important because if you think of just this little salamander and how much it poops, it doesn't make much of a difference. But when you look at how many there are, when you can say that there's thousands of them across the landscape, then collectively they can have a big impact on these ecosystem functions of the forest or wetlands or streams. What we also know, and this is really a growing field of study, is that there are several medical advancements with respect to cancer studies, with respect to medicines that we use amphibians to study and not just experiment on, but amphibians have a bunch of cool things going on. There's a group of salamanders that can regenerate their limbs. So if you cut off an arm or a leg, they'll grow it back. And this is a vertebrate, right? They have bones and they're growing back limbs. There's groups of frogs that have all these different poisons that are really complex chemically. And we use that structure of poisons to create medicines. So there's a ton of medical advancements that have hinged on what amphibians do, the things that they can provide us in terms of these chemicals or regenerations, how they, there's groups of frogs that freeze themselves in the winter up here in Illinois. And all these cool things we can copy as humans to figure out how amphibians are doing it, or to use what they're producing, these chemicals and toxins they're producing, and we can make pretty big medical advancements. What the problem is that, as I mentioned, amphibians are in decline. So we're still identifying new species. We're still studying what species that we know of are doing as well. So there are most likely dozens more advancements that we can make medically that we don't even know about yet. And we might not know about if these species keep going extinct. They might be gone forever. Okay, so we have about 7 or so minutes left. What I can do now is use this time to open it up to any questions that you all have.
That'd be great. I do actually have some questions from YouTube, and then I have other sources texting me questions.
Okay, sure.
And they're kind of all over
That's fine.
the place.
I'm ready.
All right. If I wanted to see a salamander, where could I go to find one?
Okay, good question. I would say the first thing I would do is go to water. That's the first place I would look. And if you look either in the water or on the edge of the water, under logs, under rocks, under the leaf litter, especially if it's a moist area or a little bit wet, I would say that's probably the best area, especially if there's some forest around. So if I had to pick one spot where I would look for a salamander, I would pick an area near a wetland or a pond in the forest. Alternatively, you can look next to a stream if there's flowing water or a river. Again, under rocks in the stream bed, or under rocks in the forest, or under logs in the forest. But remember, be extra careful of putting everything back that you lift up, because other organisms, including frogs and salamanders, live under these rocks and logs. So the general rule of thumb is if you lift up a log, you have to put it back exactly as you found it.
Oh, I really like that. And, as much time as I spend in the woods and in the water, I don't know that I've ever seen a salamander, that or found one myself. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. Once you see one and you know where to look, you'll see thousands.
Okay.
It's one of those weird phenomena. We have some questions on the chat. Should I answer those? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of them is, what are the things that we can do to help? Okay, so what I would do is think of it holistically. So the first thing you can do just at your home is to create habitat for amphibians. So even just digging a hole and putting a box, just a cardboard box in that hole, filling it up with water, that can create a little amphibian pond. Leaving leaf litter in your lawn and not, putting it away or just munching it up, leaving piles of leaves or logs around, that gives habitat for amphibians. So there's things that we can do directly like that. We can also limit the use of our pesticides at home. So we generally think of pesticides going into the environment by, big farms and factories, and that is definitely true. But a lot of them come from just your home. As you spray Roundup on your lawn, that gets into the waterways as well. So you can reduce that. That can help directly. Then if you broaden that out, we can support companies and organizations that limit habitat destruction on Earth, that focus on mitigating climate change. You can do a number of things that help with that as well. You can support organizations. You yourself limit how you impact climate change. There's really those two ways. You can do things at your house even to keep amphibians around. and then you can do things more broadly. Really, we just need to save as much land as we can, and we need to provide as much habitat as we can that's healthy. The second one I have here is, have you ever heard of the big nights? Are they big events where we can participate in? That's a good question. So yeah, the big nights are in the springtime, things warm up, you get a couple days of rain, and all these amphibians start moving to ponds and wetlands to breed. So you have frogs and salamanders by the thousands going to these environments, trying to find each other to lay eggs. Those are what are big nights. And the best way to help is to look locally at organizations that do this. So there's something called the Frog Call Survey in the United States, and this is probably replicated across the world, where scientists will actually use the public's help to determine when frogs are calling and where they're calling. It's a big citizen science effort. So I think that's the best way to get involved if you wanted to, was to look for local organizations that do these frog call surveys, and they'll have a bunch of information on how you can help. Debbie, did you also have more questions?
I do. So how can we fix fragmentation? And then they said why, but I think they meant where is the biggest salamander?
Okay.
Or who is the biggest salamander and where are they found?
Got it. So with respect to fragmentation, there's two things that we can do. One of which, as I just mentioned, we can save as much habitat as possible in small and big and everything. The second thing we can do is we can start making connections to existing habitat. These are called corridors. So for example, if you have two patches of forest that are separated, and in between that forest, let's say there's a bunch of farmland, we can create a patch of forest that connects the two adjacent forests together. So almost like a line in between them of forest. That will allow habitat for amphibians and other organisms to traverse through that's suitable enough. So if they couldn't get through, let's say that farmland, it was too hard to work through, it was too dry or whatever it was, then they would be able to get through that patch of forest. So we can save a bunch of habitat, and then we can connect what habitat is fragmented already. And these are all things that we're trying to do actively as scientists and policymakers. The second question, the biggest salamander, bar none, is called the giant salamander, appropriately. It lives in Japan and maybe some parts in China. They used to live all over China. I think they might be extirpated there, but there's parts of Japan and China where this giant salamander lives, and it is I think the biggest one is probably 6 or so feet long. They're that big. They're enormous. They exist today still. They live in streams and in big rivers in those parts of Asia, and they actually have cousins in North America called the hellbender. You might know it is called the snot otter. They live in streams and rivers in the southeastern United States. All of them are pretty threatened and endangered, but they still exist today.
Those are some great names. Did I hear that right? Did you say snot bender?
Snot otter.
Snot otter. That's great. It is. It's great. So here's a question about, is it possible to identify amphibians by their scat? So like, they said like a raccoon or a coyote. Do you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It all looks the same to me for the most part. You can maybe identify something. If you're lucky, you can say, I think that's a tadpole poop. But if you looked at like a salamander versus a frog, that'd be really hard to determine. There might be ways to do it, but also it's pretty small, and usually either in water or on the forest floor. So you'd have to be really lucky to do it.
Okay, that's because it would seem like it's small, and it would probably break down pretty quick.
Yeah,
being in a water environment. Yeah. That's okay.
It's mostly brown.
Yeah.
One of the unfortunately one of the world experts on amphibian poop, so it's not super identifiable.
Apologize. There was a question about asking questions. So I think what they're trying, and this got sent to me, I don't know from what source, but I think what they're trying to ask is, about research questions. How do you come up with research questions? I think is
That's a
the
good
question.
question. Yeah, I think I'm pretty typical as other scientists do. A couple ways. So I would say literally most of the time, my research questions come from me noticing something in nature. So one of the recent questions I came up with when I was driving around with my kids, my daughter saw a golf course, and we live in Chicago, so there's a lot of buildings around, and she sees this big wide open space, and she asked what that was, and I said it was a golf course. And then I thought, well, I wonder if there's amphibians there. So I was able to write a grant to get funding to study the amphibians on golf courses in this really urbanized area. So I would say a lot of the questions come from me just you know thinking them and just living in the natural world. The other way is by reading other scientists' work. Other scientists do great, really amazing work, and we like to build on each other's work. So a lot of my questions come from reading another scientist's study and saying, that's great, I think I can do this that's a little bit different, or will answer one of their unanswered questions, or in a variety of those ways. So I think those are really the two ways that I come up with them primarily. The third way is sometimes it just kind of comes to you. So another study I have ongoing now is looking at the impact of a fire that occurred in the mountains on the salamander species that I study. So that wasn't necessarily something that we sought out to do, but the fire occurred unnaturally, and it was just an opportunity to start researching the effects of that fire. So really, I think those three ways. Oftentimes, it's just stuff I come up with, which is the coolest thing about being a scientist is, you can think of these crazy things and then you get to actually do them.
That is really cool. Well, and as I'm listening to you, I was thinking more about how you're almost constantly scanning for patterns. You're
Yeah,
patterns and cause and effect are probably a couple of
yeah,
big skills you use.
yeah. It's you don't think about it as being scared. It's almost like how the scientist's brain is wired. It's just it's always kind of in the back of our mind.
Yeah.
What sort of things are going on, these connections that might be made,
I,
and sometimes they naturally surface.
on my walk to work, that's my challenge. I always try to find one to post a scientific phenomenon. So I think you're right. It's really interesting. Does anybody in here have another question? I think I've got all of them. If I've missed any, I will get those to you. I know that you're really nice about and then try to connect them to the people. So
Yeah, go ahead, please contact me. I think I put up my Twitter and my email and whatnot, my website.
Yes. And just so everybody knows, he is very responsive to email and to Twitter. So, and also very generous with his research. So if you're a classroom teacher and you're hands-on on some kind of research that you want to use to challenge your students, then just send him a tweet and he will get that to you. He's just, you've been wonderful to work with.
It's good. My wife's an environmental educator, so that helps as well.
That's wonderful.
I didn't help.
That's wonderful. Well, I appreciate your time. We hope to have you again next year.
Yeah.
So
next year.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye all.
Take care. Bye everybody.
Yeah.